Welcome to our next video, which highlights the distinctives of the Gospel of Luke, including things like the Sermon on the Plain and Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. This is part of our Bible reading plan with Anthem Church, and today's video comes from a discussion I led a few years ago and is edited to give you the essential background information to better understand the significance of the Gospel of Luke. So let's get started. We talked a lot last time about that transition from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And so when I think about just Luke on its own, it really provides a distinct perspective on the historical biography of Jesus. So I want to highlight 5 aspects that make Luke unique before we pick up and looking at chapter 9, which begins in the next section called the Journey to Jerusalem. And so let's look at these different distinctives of the Old and the New. The Sermon on the Plain, the Journey to Jerusalem, this major section in the book of Luke. And then he does a couple things unique, just with sending out these 72 disciples, and then something called a parable that we'll highlight a little bit too. So as the book of Luke begins, it emphasizes the significant transition in human history that we talked about a little bit, this movement from the old to the new era. Luke represented this through 2 people, through John the Baptist, who is looking forward to the Messiah, and then he represented the new era. So John the Baptist was the old era. The new era is Jesus, who's the promised Messiah. And so this new era is the beginning of the end, which sounds intense, but just means that the old era has not entirely ended, but continues right alongside our new era. And so Christians today live in an overlap of the 2 eras, the old and the new. And our fundamental identity is defined by the new era, but we live in this transition time with the old era, where sin and weakness from the previous era continues to hamper us until a future day. Then someday Jesus will return and fully restore humanity at the end of the age. And so until then, we live in this tension of the already but not yet, which is important for Luke to make clear, as God's people are no longer defined by a Jewish identity represented in the Mosaic Law, but now possess a new gospel identity represented in what we talked about, the New Covenant. And it's not achieved by our works, it's achieved really by what Christ has done. We're going to look at that, his work on the cross. And our part is trusting in Jesus, who accomplished the work on the cross, offers forgiveness to all of humanity for breaking God's good world. And so Luke spends a lot of time emphasizing the significance of God's gift of forgiveness, which, if accepted, will entirely change a person's life by the grace of this second chance to know and live for God. So you'll see that teaching of forgiveness emphasized in the book of Luke in a very unique way. Now, the Sermon on the Plain, this was in Luke 6:17 through 49. This is unique to Luke. Unlike the parallel sermon in the Gospel of Matthew that you might have heard called the Sermon on the Mount, that spoke into a Jewish perspective in the Mosaic Law. It was longer. Luke literally levels the playing field, calling it the Sermon on the Plain. He wants everyone to have equal access to an understanding of God's love for all people, and especially for those that might feel like an outsider. He's going to emphasize just Jesus' kingdom rule, how it reverses humanity's values as his followers live this out, his radical generosity, his service to those who are without means, people who are without the social, emotional, spiritual resources to live. He speaks into the poor, and that's how he understood the poor. It wasn't just financial. He saw it as a holistic understanding of people without social, emotional, spiritual resources. And so Jesus in the Sermon on the Plain is using this message to reshape his disciples into leaders for his cause, reaching out to all people, the whole world. And so he's casting this vision of the kind of life he envisions for them and calls them to practice as his followers. That's the Sermon on the Plain. That's unique to the Gospel of Luke. The third thing that's unique to the Gospel of Luke is this long journey that in Luke 9:51 it starts and it ends in Luke 19:41. We're going to look at that a bit more in detail, but you'll see in Luke 9:51 it says that Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. And then for 10 chapters, he's moving that direction. And so this dramatic statement signals a transition in the story. It's lengthening the reader's time to process who Jesus is, and in light of a growing opposition that you start to read more and more about in this journey to Jerusalem. And so in response, we see how Jesus turns to his closest followers in this journey. He's focusing on teaching them more than teaching the crowds. He might teach to the crowds, but it's really to help the disciples, those 12, really learn about who he is. And he's teaching them about what will be required of them, the cost of following him, the upcoming challenges, and also the blessings of his kingdom. Now, for us, what I love about this section is this travel narrative reminds us how we likewise are on a journey with Jesus. We're leaving things behind that are holding us back, and it's so that we can trust in Jesus by taking steps of faith as we move forward with him. So each parable, each story Jesus shares, each message that he gives to his disciples on this journey, it's causing us to slow down with them and take the time needed to process what Jesus is revealing to us about the cost and the purpose in following him fully. And so this is the journey to Jerusalem. There's two more distinctives in the Gospel of Luke, and this one is really significant for us. So he sends out 72 disciples in Luke 10. We looked at that in our reading. It speaks to the urgency of reaching all the nations of the earth with the good news. So in the other Gospels, which emphasize the sending of his 12 disciples, here Jesus expands those he trains and sends out with an additional 72. And he's showing how the mission of Jesus is not limited to just his 12, but it's a calling that he's giving to all of his disciples, all of his followers, to go and do likewise. And so while the testimony of the 12 is unique, the 12 created a foundation from which the church is built. You can read about that in Ephesians 2. At the same time, by including this account of Jesus sending out the 72 disciples, we can know as we read these stories in Luke that we're to receive them as our calling to live out his mission like he called these 72. And so it's really expanding our understanding of how Jesus makes disciples. It started with the 12, he focused on them, but there were other groups that we can see, like this 72, that had a special sending out that we can identify with, because we're not the 12, but we are a disciple, we're a follower of Jesus, and so we are sent like these 72 were sent. The fifth distinctive is the parables of Jesus. So Luke has a significant number of parables. He has parables in the other Gospels as well. And so Luke, though, has a special focus on having a larger number of parables. Now, in the New Testament, the word parable means to throw or to place alongside. So a parable, you can think of it in a conceptual idea that's placed alongside another idea for the purpose of comparison. Someone once described it here. You can see it on the screen. It's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. So Jesus's parables compare a physical truth with a spiritual truth. And he's using a concrete, relatable story that the reader would understand to reveal an unknown spiritual reality that Jesus wants his disciples to understand with greater clarity. Now, this does a few things. For the non-disciple, especially those in opposition to Jesus, because the parables are an indirect form of communication, Jesus uses these parables to also hide what is truth. He wants to hide what is true from them, to delay their plans that are to end his ministry, and he's going to do that to delay it until God's timing. And then at the same time, he's going to demonstrate the error of their thinking for the reader, and at times the disciples are going to recognize that as well. And so it does a sense of hiding from those who are in opposition, but it also shows those who are following him the error in their ways. And so he's teaching the disciples through those who are in opposition to him. He's teaching them the truth of his ways. by showing the error in his opponent's ways. And so parables are really interesting, and we'll look at a few. But as we understand how to interpret parables, I want us to kind of understand a few rules that can make more sense of how to read them. And so it's helpful to know the rules necessary to guide our correct interpretation of the parables that we read in Luke. And so here are four. The first one is to understand the knowledge of God, the content of each parable that's behind the parable. So each parable assumes you have an accurate knowledge of God, which is why the disciples scratch their head at times, because they lack this understanding of God. They're thinking more from the old era, not from the new era. So that's where Jesus is trying to teach a new way of thinking in the new era that's not like the old. And so he's using these concrete parables of truths from their day to kind of connect to the spiritual reality that's in the new era. The second thing is to observe the literary content. So Jesus was explaining some kind of problem, or he's answering some kind of question. So if you look for the problem, look for the question, the answer to the question, that can really help you identify his main point. So by identifying the question or the answer, this helps you focus your interpretation on the central idea Jesus is communicating. Third, understand the cultural context. So the writer is using what was common for them to make sense of a spiritual reality. We don't have that sense of that, what was common to them. We need to do our work to understand what was the cultural context of that time. And so the interpreter must be conversant with the history and customs of the biblical times, especially as parables were to relate with the original audience. And so it requires some cultural understanding. The last thing, the fourth point, is to interpret only those details that relate directly to the central idea of the parable. Every detail is not important. And so be careful of mishandling figures of speech, especially because we can draw out more than what Jesus was trying to communicate by trying to over interpret all the details of a parable. It's really just to make one point. And he's using a story to make it really simple to remember. And so as we're looking at these parables, remember they're simple, memorable forms of communication. They're not intended to have complex meaning with an elaborate interpretation. So just focus on the central idea. And so